In this session, we're going to look at team culture and failure. Let's look back at the 5 dysfunctions of a team from Lencioni in 2002. We looked at this in lecture 1, but understanding the 5 dysfunctions of a team also give us an insight into team culture. At the very base of the pyramid, and there's a reason it's a pyramid, because if you don't have trust, then you can't build the other things. At the base of the pyramid of Lencioni's 5 dysfunctions is absence of trust. So he's telling us that a fundamental aspect of team functionality and team performance is trust. And this relates to the concepts we discussed in relation to coursework 1 to do with psychological safety. Because as human beings, we basically want to be invulnerable. So we don't want to expose our weaknesses, we don't want to expose our insecurities, and therefore we don't tend to be honest with each other and also with ourselves. And that's just a natural human trait. The result of that is it becomes impossible to build trust within the team because we're not being honest with each other or ourselves. So in many cases it's almost as though we're conditioned to keep our guards up. And that unfortunately is compounded by the fact that we are more likely to do that when we're in a situation of forming a new team or joining a new team. Because remember, when we're talking about teams, it's natural to consider a team forming like you would in a group work at university or a more controlled environment where nobody belonged to the group or the team to begin with, and then the team was formed. But the reality in many organizational teams is that the team existed already and you are joining it as a new member of the team. We also live in a society where the idea of weakness and exposing weaknesses is frowned upon, and all of these elements combine to make the potential for building trust within a team a steep challenge even at the very beginning. How does a team go about building trust at the initial stages? And that is both for examples of teams starting from scratch and indeed when teams change, when new members join or when members leave. How do we go about building trust? There are a lot of exercises that you'll actually be familiar with, and you are likely to have gone through them yourselves in different settings already in your grown-up lives in particular. Personal histories exercises are often used at an early stage of team building because it's a non-controversial way of getting to know other members of your team, where they come from, what they're about. And you may have done that kind of thing in icebreakers, as they're called, in, say, for example, tutorial sessions at university or when you've joined clubs and societies. And certainly if you've worked during your time at university, there may have been these sorts of informal onboarding exercises to try to build a sense of trust and understanding among team members. In organizations, very often they look at team effectiveness exercises. So they're looking at going through challenges as a team and looking at what elements of the contributions made by the different members were important to the outcome of the challenge. So they're identifying, let's call it, capabilities within the team. But then in the same process, what they're also doing when they're looking at team effectiveness is trying to be open about what approaches either must be changed or indeed eliminated for the good of the team's performance in the future. So it's a bit, you could call it role play, but what they are doing is simulating moments where the team is challenged in the future and trying to identify in a neutral way, in an environment which is safe, trying to identify points of approach or process or even people's personality styles that need to be changed or eliminated for the good of the effectiveness of the team in the future. Big organizations also go often through personality behavioral preference profiling procedures. You may have heard of the Briggs-Meyer psychological testing, basically putting you in a box, the kind of personality you have. These are quite blunt instruments, but they serve to give at least a comparative basis of understanding of the different types of people who belong to an organization, and therefore maybe form more effective teams depending on their personality types. So they're going through the basic process of understanding who are we, why do we do what we do. So that brings into it motivations, and motivations will be discussed in the course at a later date. But just getting that sense of the personalities that form the team. That process only works if there's 360-degree feedback, i.e. 360-degree feedback means that feedback is flowing in both directions along a hierarchy, if there is a hierarchy, and there often will be some degree of hierarchy in any organizational structure. So people feel empowered to offer feedback and voice concerns up the chain, as well as feedback being delivered down the chain. And I mentioned role play. Often an early means of establishing trust is to put the team into an experiential environment and just let them get on with it. And that's where you will have heard of team building days, and that's why they're called team building days. Is at the basis there's an effort to establish trust, and by putting the team in a different environment and challenging them, they learn more about their effectiveness and the way they organize as a team, and it gives them a chance to reflect on how that might be translated for their actual performance in the real world. So these processes are used regularly and are important, and the idea of experiential team exercises will be something that you handle in the development of your second piece of coursework. And usually in the team you're going to have a leadership element. Whether that leadership is one individual or is a process that's distributed among team members, or there's a cluster of leadership roles within a team depending on its size, we have to consider the role of leadership in establishing trust. And these are basic positive human traits to bring to any interactive situation. But what comes from Lencioni's work is that leadership needs to display empathy and vulnerability at this point in order to make sure that trust is genuine, because if there isn't a demonstration of vulnerability and empathy from the leadership, then those ideas that we mentioned earlier to do with the fact that we are naturally minded to have our guards up and not be honest, we can instinctively tell if someone is not being honest and empathetic. The result being that if it's not shown from the leadership, it won't be fostered among the other team members. So the leadership role is important in establishing authentic trust, if you like. You're trying to perhaps make a point of demonstrating vulnerability that is genuine in an effort to demonstrate that it's okay to be vulnerable. And by showing that vulnerability, the rest of the team will embrace the idea of being honest with both the things that they're finding difficult, the things that they feel that they are strong in, and as a result, trust is improved. And what you're seeing with Lencioni's 5 dysfunctions of a team is you're progressing up the pyramid. So the idea of fear of conflict, which is the next one up, the existence of a fear of conflict will be based on an absence of trust. So you can see how each element relates to the element before it in the pyramid. If trust isn't present, essentially people will not engage with one another. And the result of that is an artificial harmony. So they may be functioning on the surface, but the harmony is synthetic. It's something that people are pretending in order to get on with their day-to-day. That can lead to important decisions not being made and people becoming angry, basically because people don't have the psychological safety, as we've talked about. They don't have the psychological safety to challenge or to voice concerns about certain things, and that leads to people not taking initiative and not making decisions potentially. And the tension that results in that boils over and people become angry. So you can see, even at this second stage of the pyramid, a lack of establishment of trust, which leads to a fear of conflict, creates an atmosphere whereby there isn't effective teamwork going on. Now, let's not forget that conflict can also be good. And we will talk about conflict as well in another one of the lectures. We'll talk about it specifically and look at the different characteristics of different forms of conflict. But just to touch on it at the moment, conflict can be good, mainly if it's ideologically based. So what you're not wanting is interpersonal conflict. So you are challenging someone on the basis of what they're like, what you know them to be like. Mean-spirited attacks, as in perhaps spiteful or self-serving remarks or actions that create conflict, that creates disharmony in the team. Teams generally avoid this sort of thing to spare one another's feelings. Now, that sounds good, but actually, if people do disagree or people do have an issue with a certain decision or a certain approach to something, then a high-functioning team will have established the trust and indeed the culture, which we're going to come on to talk about in this lecture. They will have established a basis by which they can voice their feelings without fear of that being taken personally by another member of the team and therefore hurting their feelings. So in fact, conflict can be good, but if people try to avoid conflict on the basis of there being a fear about hurting someone's feelings, then that ultimately leads to increased tension as well. So it has an inverse effect to that which is intended. What can a leader do to counteract this? Well, considering we know that there is an idea of positive conflict, then a leader or the leadership role needs to be sensitive to the fact that some conflict is good. They need to be aware of if it's ideological conflict. By that I mean there are disagreement in terms of views on approaches or processes that are based in the agenda or the goals of the team, and that's a kind of conflict that you want, because the challenge may result in a better way forward being established. So they need to be sensitive. The leadership role needs to be sensitive to the idea that some conflict is good and be able to identify potential conflict or ongoing conflict which is bad. So they should model appropriate conflict behavior through the processes and the culture that they establish in the team. And they also want resolution to occur naturally, because the process of letting resolution occur naturally is also sending a signal to the team that you trust them. Because if leadership makes an intervention in conflict, there is an implicit message that they do not trust the team members to resolve the conflict themselves. And that returns us to the base of the pyramid, diminishing trust within the team. Often, leadership function needs to find a way of mining for conflict, and by that I mean they recognize that conflict is buried beneath the surface. It's not necessarily manifest in what you can see in front of you, but you can recognize that there are tensions bubbling under beneath the surface, and by mining that tension and bringing it to the surface, it allows the team to perform more effectively and retain trust. There has to be transparency about sensitive issues, and in today's performance productivity environment, quite often it's easy to ignore issues because they don't seem to give a direct return on the team's goals. And that's essentially a short-sighted approach, because by bringing sensitive issues to the surface and dealing with them head on, in the long run, you create a more efficient, effective, happy team, which will, in the long run, be more productive. But often it's a brave leadership function that tackles it head on, because it's easier just to drive for next week's results or next month's results. The other side of it is to reassure people, returning to the base of the pyramid, reassure people that if they are uncomfortable or if they're unsure of what they're doing, it's okay, because feeling unsure of your role or being uncomfortable with what you're doing, but fearing creating conflict as a result of raising it, ultimately works against the team's interests.